Today we want to talk about what is character. We defined it a couple of weeks ago as being when we live for truth as defined by God, right? We don't get to choose what truth is. Whatever God says is how we should be. And so today for Father's Day, I thought, well, is there a man in the Bible? Do you remember on Mother's Day, I preached about Deborah and Jael, who killed a man with her hammer and her nail. If you weren't here, it was a very uplifting Mother's Day sermon. And so today I thought, well, I'm going to tell you the story of a man in the Bible. It's not my normal sermon where I read a scripture and then give you some points. Instead, I'm going to tell you the story about a man in the Bible there's many, many chapters dedicated to him. And that is the Old Testament Joseph. You know, there's some New Testament Josephs, like the father of Jesus. But today we're going to be in the Old Testament, and you find Joseph's story in chapters 29 through 50 of the book of Genesis. So settle in while I read all 16 chapters to you. I didn't think you'd appreciate that. You're all like, can she finish this in half an hour? Don't worry. But I kind of debated how to do this. Do I just pick apart a few of the highlights? But I actually want to tell you the whole story. I'll tell it to you. I'll paraphrase it in the translation of Collene. I'm sure it's very literal. But I want you to hear kind of the entirety of his story, because when you look at his story throughout time and years, you see his true character. Don't we see people's true character in different seasons of their life? And how people react to things, right? It's when we dig deep down and see people's true character that we see who they really are. And we see that over time. So we start in Genesis 29. Can anybody remember? I did a little trivia in first service. We'll see if second service is a little faster today. I think they were sleepy today. Who was Joseph's great-grandfather? Abraham. Thank you. Some of you remember the story. Do you remember the story of Abraham and Sarah? He's considered one of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, one of the major characters in the Old Testament. And Abraham married a woman named Sarah. They started out as Abram and Sarah. I remember God changes their name. And God says to Abraham and Sarah, you will have a son. And they wait, and they're getting kind of old. I'm not defining what that means. Like my age. And they're getting impatient. Where is the son you have promised us? So Sarah decides, well, I'm going to give him my servant girl to have a baby with. Ladies, this is not advisable behavior. I'm just saying. But, the Old Testament is full of drama. It's a bit of a soap opera. So Abraham ends up having one son with the servant girl, and then many years later, in their 80s, they have Isaac. Now, any of you older than me, how would you be excited about this? I don't know. This, I'm not sure how I would see that news, but they've been waiting all this time, so they have a son named Isaac. Isaac marries Rebecca. My notes are behind me. They have two children, Jacob and Esau. You remember the story? They're twins. There's a fallout. Jacob runs. Jacob then decides to get married, and he falls in love with a beautiful woman named Rachel. Do you guys remember this story? Yeah, so Jacob agrees to Rachel's father. I will work for 7 years, and then at the end of the 7 years, I will get to marry Rachel. My dad did not make Dirk work that long for me. Apparently, I'm not worth as much. So he works for 7 years, and the father is now he has a problem. The problem is that the oldest daughter is not married yet. And apparently, that's the way the oldest daughter should always be married first, because now she's getting old. So he decides to trick Jacob and gives him Leah, his oldest daughter, as his wife. And the next morning, Jacob is not too happy to find out that he has been tricked. into marrying Leah. So he then marries Rachel and has to work for another 7 years because now he's got to work off his debt for the other daughter. And in a long story short, Jacob ends up having 12 sons and a daughter. I know, I'm like, I have one. It's really enough. I'm fine. Some of you had more than one. There's actually lots of parents of boys here. So I'm sure it makes your house maybe even crazier. I don't know. Mine seems crazy enough with one of each. But so he has 12 sons. 6 of his sons are to Leah. Rachel can't have children, is waiting, pleading with God. Then he has 2 sons to each of his wives' servant girls. Again, not advisable. Men, you can only handle one. I'm just saying. Huh? Barely that, right. Trying to juggle 2 is not a good idea. So now he has all these sons to several women. This was the way of the Old Testament. We don't do this these days. We should not. And then he finally has 2 sons to Rachel, his 2 youngest sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Rachel dies in childbirth, having Benjamin. And we come to 17 years later when Joseph is tending the sheep. And this is probably the most famous story about Joseph. What did you learn in Sunday school about Joseph? The coat. He gets this coat. So because Joseph and Benjamin are the sons to Rachel, the beloved wife, they become Jacob's favorite children. We shouldn't have favorites. But, I mean, everyone knows I am the favorite. Danny's not even in here to argue with me. We would all say another person's the favorite. If you quizzed Becky, Dan, or I, Becky would say Dan was the favorite. Dan, it's me. Well, that's true. I don't mean to brag or anything, but, you know. But Jacob has 2 favored sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And Joseph is tending the sheep with his brothers, and he gets this beautiful coat, the coat of many colors. Remember, you saw this in your Sunday school little books if you grew up in Sunday school. And he puts it on, and the brothers are pretty mad. Right? Did you ever get mad at your sibling because they got something you didn't? I told the first service that my spiritual gift is whining. I'm really, really, really good at it. I've perfected it. Jesus would be so proud. But I was really good at it. It's not fair. How many of you ever said that to your parents? You like them better than me. I remember when I left home and I saw all the stuff my sister was allowed to do. I was like, where did those parents go when I was growing up? I was like, that's not fair. I was never allowed to go out past 8 o'clock. No, that's sort of a lie. But Joseph has this coat of many colors, and his brothers are jealous. And I can kind of see why. This is really not fair. Why did he get the favored coat? But Joseph remains faithful to his father. He remains faithful to his brothers. The brothers are doing terrible things. And then Joseph, now see, sometimes silence is better. But Joseph has a dream. When he's around 17 years old, he has a dream that his brothers bowed down to him. Now, if I were Joseph, I might have kept that little dream to myself. I have not gone to my siblings lately, and God, I had this dream that you would bow down to me. I'm not sure they would appreciate it. I'm just saying. So if you have a dream like this, you might want to keep it to yourself. But Joseph tells the brothers, and now the brothers are really mad. So the brothers decide, they've already kind of tortured Joseph for these 17 years. Some of you maybe I never had an older brother, but, they can be the best or the worst, I suppose. And they decide, we're going to get rid of this guy. We've had it. We're mad about this, and who does he think he is? He thinks he's all special. And so they decide, initially they talk about, well, maybe we'll kill him. But instead they see these people walking by, and they say, let's just sell him into slavery. And I want you to think about, you're 17 years old, your siblings have just sold you into slavery. How do you feel? I wouldn't be going, wow, my siblings are amazing. They just literally sold me into slavery. And then they kill an animal and put the blood on the coat, take the coat back to dad and say, he's dead. So you're in slavery, your dad's grieving, and Joseph gets to decide, how will he respond to this? How will he live his life? So Joseph, now he's in slavery. He goes with the men who have bought him, and he is sold again to a man named Potiphar. You might remember the story of Potiphar. We find it in Genesis 39. Potiphar is the captain of the palace guard under Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So he's a very important person, not the most important person, but he's a very important person. And he finds favor with Joseph. Joseph is basically his slave. Here's what Genesis 39 says to us about Joseph and Potiphar. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted him to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now that's a great life, isn't it? I'm just going to put Joseph, my slave, in charge. I'm going to sit back and just eat. That's his job. He just eats. And Joseph takes care of everything for him. And so here's Joseph in a bad situation. Have you ever been in a bad situation? Right? We've all had bad situations, sometimes of our own doing, sometimes because of others, and sometimes it's just because life happens. And so he's in a bad situation, and he had a choice to make. How do I respond? See, sometimes we cannot choose our circumstances, but we can choose how we respond to it. And I am a master at responding with whining. I remember when I was a mother of little ones. Mine are big now. But when they were little, I remember, sorry, Alexa, there was a stage that she went through where she perfected the art of whining, which clearly she did not get from me. And I remember thinking to myself, I would rather deal with a temper tantrum on the floor at Walmart than this incessant whining. Yeah. It's the most irritating thing on earth. And I'm sure that there are moments that God is like, shut up to me. Stop whining. So isn't it true, though, that we get to respond to the situations we find ourselves in? And sometimes the situations stink. Sometimes, some of you today, I had multiple calls this week from people in the church who are struggling with some really tough stuff. Really tough things. And so we get to respond to those things. Are we going to respond like Joseph, who does his very best work in every situation, who takes care of his master, who does good work that's recognized? Or will you be like me and we hide in our office and we whine? See, Joseph shows us, even from a young age, what character looks like. We show our true character when bad things happen and we respond in the way that Christ would want us to. Then something happens. Joseph is described as a handsome young man. And his wife takes a little interest in him. And I'll be delicate. There's children in the room. Rayanne's like, ah! And so she tries to entice him. You all know what I mean. And so Joseph, listen, this is a free opportunity. He could have been like, woohoo! Instead, Joseph's like, I'm out of here. So, right, all of us are tempted. All of us have things in our lives that tempt us. We cannot make temptation go away, but we can figure out how to deal with it. And so Joseph's like, I am not getting in this situation. So he runs out. He's like, I'm out of here. He runs away. He thinks he's doing the right thing. Well, he left his coat behind. And Potiphar's wife, I love in the Old Testament, sometimes women just don't have a name. She's just Potiphar's wife. And she's like, look what I got. I have your coat. And she accuses him of wrongdoing. And so once again, Joseph finds himself in a situation that he has not caused, but he's suffering the consequences of, and he is now sitting in jail. Again, listen, if I find myself in jail and I haven't done anything wrong, I'm going to be using my spiritual gift of whining and complaining. And Joseph once again is faced with, how do I respond? How do I respond to this? And he decides that he will do what he did in Potiphar's house. He will work to find favor with the prison warden. And so the prison warden puts him in charge of everything that happens in the prison, and I guess he gets to sit back and eat. It says in verse 23 of Genesis 39, the warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. I am going to use my life in a positive way, even though I have found myself here. And that is what Joseph does. Joseph decides that in the middle of this crappy situation, I will live upright, and then people took notice. The next thing that happens is two people who have worked for the king end up in jail. The cupbearer and the chief baker. Okay, we've talked about this before. The cupbearer, that's actually a job for the king. The cupbearer is somebody who's very trusted, who before they give the cup of wine or whatever they're giving to the king, they have to drink it first and make sure they don't drop out of poisoning, so it's safe to give to the king to drink. And he did something that made the king angry, so he's in jail with Joseph along with the chief baker. And they both have dreams. And they ask, what do these dreams mean? And you can read this in chapter 40 of Genesis. Joseph ends up telling them what their dreams mean. So some of my dreams, I'm not sure I want to know the meaning of. Have you ever had really bizarre dreams? I have not dreamed that my siblings bow down to me, but I'm sure they're relieved. He tells them, basically, the chief baker, you're going to go back to the king tomorrow and you're going to die. But the cupbearer is going to be restored to his cupbearing job. And Joseph says to the cupbearer, please remember me to the king. So what does the cupbearer do? Nothing. He goes back to his job. He forgets all about Joseph. And then the Pharaoh has a dream. It's a pretty elaborate, long dream. And the cupbearer suddenly remembers, this is 2 years later, there's this guy in jail who might be able to interpret your dream. And so they call Joseph in, and Joseph says to Pharaoh, well, here's what your dream means. Your dream means that for the next 7 years, you will have abundance in your crops and your livestock, and you will become very wealthy. But the 7 years after that, you will have a major famine. So you need to use the next 7 years to prepare for the 7 years after that when there will be nothing. And because of this, Joseph is now given a new position, new favor with the king. He becomes the overseer, and he travels from town to town, helping them stock up supplies for the 7 years that are to come. Eventually, a famine hits all of the land. And most of the people don't have to worry because Joseph has helped them prepare for this time. But Jacob's brothers are experiencing famine and they have nothing. So Jacob sends 10 of the 11 remaining boys to Egypt. He keeps Benjamin. He's too afraid to send Benjamin. He sends the 10 older sons to Egypt to see if they can buy food, and they appear before Joseph. Now, I don't know about you, but if my siblings sold me into slavery, and all these years later, they come back to me and they're like, now that you're wealthy and you have all this stuff, you owe us something. I'd be like, right, see ya. Most of us aren't that forgiving, but they come before Joseph. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. He says, I want you to go home and bring your brother home back with you. And then in Genesis 45, we see the encounter between Joseph and his brothers all these years later. Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Would you have that grace? To be able to see that I have gone through these tough things because God placed me here at this time for a reason. See, I'm too busy whining to see what God's trying to do. And so I chose this story of Joseph today because when we look over the events of his life, we get to see a man who shows us character all the way through. How he responded to life's circumstances. How he did not crumble in the middle of trials. How he was consistent in the things that he said were important to him. If we look at the entirety of his story, we see a man that has much character and someone we could be like. So let's just pull out a few things from his life that teach us about having character. And the first thing is he is faithful. We see him being faithful to his father, to his brothers, to Potiphar, to the prisoners, to Pharaoh, and then again to his brothers. Joseph does not allow his circumstances or the way others treat him how to define how he would react. Having character is being a person who will take the high road every single time, regardless of what others do to us. Don't we live in a society where we are taught how you treat me is how I'm going to treat you? Right? That's what we're taught. If you punch me, right? I've never had anyone punch me, but I suppose it could happen. But that's what we're taught. If you're kind to me, I'll be kind to you. And Joseph shows us an example that godly character always requires us to treat people better than they treat us. And isn't that hard? Listen, I don't always feel like being nice to people who are mean to me. That's just human nature. But some of you have been really good examples of that that sometimes we rise above it and we treat people with love and respect even if they don't deserve it. Now, I don't mean that we should all just stay in unhealthy situations, but when we can react with kindness and love. Joseph shows us consistency. We need to learn to make the right decision every single time. All of us make the right decision sometimes, but we don't always make the right decision every time. And isn't this what the world hates about people who claim to be Christians? They say, well, they go to that church and they say on Sunday that they're supposed to act like this, and look what they're doing on Tuesday. The world is looking for us to be consistent, to live what we say we're going to live. I'm really good at telling you how to live, but I have to learn how to actually do it. And sometimes it's not easy. But Joseph shows us time and time again, which is why I chose to kind of show you much of his story, because he shows us consistently what it means to have character in our lives. We see that Joseph is principled, right? He's faced with temptation, and we all are, and he's like, I'm out of here, and he runs away. He still ends up getting in trouble. Here's one thing that many people need to learn: how to be competent and trustworthy. I have learned that when I became senior pastor at the church, I did not experience this in the church, okay? So let me just make that clear. But outside of the church, I'm pretty sure I have found every incompetent person on the planet to deal with. Pastor Emily, I will get off the phone and go, why can't anyone do their job? Why are some people just so bad? Take pride in whatever your job is. Maybe you're sitting here going, I hate my job is terrible, and maybe you do. Maybe you have the worst job in the world. But our job is to do that job to the best of our ability, to be consistent and competent and trustworthy. I remember I've had phone calls with people like in the government. It's so annoying. And I actually had somebody tell me that, I should do something. And I was like, that is not my job. I'm a pastor. That's not my job. My job is to preach. What you're telling me to do is your job, not mine. Why in the world are you telling me to do this? I mean, is it not beyond frustrating? Yeah, just do your job. Just be good at it. Wherever God has placed you right now, maybe it's not your dream job. Maybe you wish it were different. But whatever you're doing right now, be good. Just be good. Do it better than everybody else because it shows character. Don't just do enough to get by. Have pride in it. Let people know that you're committed to doing the best that you can. That's what Joseph did. My goodness, the guy was employed by the prison as a prisoner. And he decided, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability because that is a sign of having good character. We say to the fathers today, we desperately need people who will do the right thing. I say to the women too, but the world needs people who will just do the right thing. We see Joseph being an overcomer or perseverance. Some of you will say to me, well, I had a really tough upbringing. And some of you did. Some of you faced some really tough stuff, things that I could not possibly relate to. But look at Joseph. Joseph had 10 brothers who hated him. Joseph had brothers who sold him into slavery. Joseph's mother died when he was young. His upbringing wasn't that great. And yet he learned to persevere, to just keep going. Joseph learned to show mercy. We have character in us when we learn to show mercy to people who don't deserve it. I mean, I don't know how I would feel if I was suddenly faced with these 10 guys who threw me into slavery and then I ended up in prison. I wouldn't be too thrilled. I'm not sure I would welcome them in and give them what they needed. I'd be like, well, suffer then. That's our instinct. But when we have character, we'll be people of mercy. Joseph experienced betrayal, things that had lasting consequences, but he shows mercy and he offers forgiveness. Do we live like Joseph? Do we think about having integrity? How do we react to the bad things that happen in our lives? You know, some days you might find me in my office, like under the desk, mad or crying or whatever, probably whining. How do we handle pressure? Do we do the best work we can at whatever we're doing? Because that is how we show people Jesus.